So it's now time for our first presenter, the precocious Ameline Cook, our youngest Audubon Everglades volunteer, who will tell us about the essential role of dark skies during Everglades during Florida's peak migratory season. Through her insights, we hope that you will have a better understanding of the challenges that birds face and the need to reduce light pollution. Ameline, if you would share your screen and take it away, I'm sure they'll look forward to seeing you and not me anymore.
Hi. Okay. Hold on.
Hello, Ameline. We can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Hi again, everyone. My name's Ameline Cook. Remember to turn your lights off during migration. October is the peak season for migratory songbirds that are visiting or passing by here in Florida. These birds rely on a combination of nighttime cues like stars, the Earth's magnetic fields, and the moon to guide them during their long journeys. They use the darkness both to migrate and to rest along the way. Sadly, too many bright lights at night can be a real problem for these migrating birds. Bright lights can confuse birds and make them lose their way. They need to rest and eat, but light pollution can keep them all up at night. And just like us, birds need to sleep to stay healthy. Sometimes the lights can lead them to dangerous areas such as cities where they can fly into buildings. Imagine trying to find your way with a flashlight shining in your eyes. But it's not just the birds that suffer. Other animals like moths that pollinate different plants at night and sea turtles trying to nest or hatch are also affected by light pollution. Even us humans are affected by lights. It can lead to stress, anxiety, and various health issues, including health problems in growing kids like me. But there are simple ways to make a big difference. It doesn't take much to make a huge difference. You can use lights with a warm amber color, turn on lights only when necessary, and buy outside lights that direct the light downwards and have shields to prevent it from glowing everywhere. Use lights only when necessary and use automatic lights. You can also talk to your neighbors and local businesses about better lighting. And here's a bonus. When you use energy efficient lights, you are not only help the light and environment, but also save money on electricity bills. You can also help by joining a program called globeatnight.org from October 4th to 13th. It's like a citizen science program where you can help protect our night sky and everything that depends on it. To learn more about dark skies, you can also visit the International Dark Sky Association website that is in the chat. When you make these simple changes, you'll not only enjoy stargazing better, but also help our natural world. Thank you.
Thank you, Amelia. That was very good. Excellent.
This past Wednesday, we had a lively book discussion on Dr. Marzluff's book, Gifts of the Crow, which was facilitated by AE volunteer Blue Kaufman, who was a business development specialist for the Nature Conservancy. And we are excited to now bring you our featured presenter of the evening, Dr. John Marzluff, who of course wrote the book, The Gift of Crows, the man shaping the way the world thinks about corvids. Introducing Dr. John Marzluff is writer, editor, sustainability specialist, and our wonderful book discussion host, Blue Kaufman. Blue, it's all you.
Hi, everyone. It's an honor to be able to introduce Dr. John Marzluff. He is a professor of wildlife science at the University of Washington. His graduate and initial postdoctoral research focused on the social behavior and ecology of jays and ravens. He continues this theme of investigating the intriguing behavior of crows, ravens, and jays. He teaches ornithology, governance, and conservation of rare species, field research in Yellowstone, and natural and cultural history of Costa Rica. Professor Marzluff has written 6 books and edited several others, including The Gift of Crows, which was the most recent book we discussed last week at the Audubon Everglades Book Club. Dr. Marzluff has mentored over 40 graduate students and authored over 170 scientific papers on various aspects of bird behavior and wildlife management. He is a member of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Recovery Team for the critically endangered Mariana crow, a former member of the Washington Biodiversity Council, a fellow of the American Ornithologist Union, a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and a National Geographic Explorer. His presentation tonight, Think Like a Raven, is a culmination of collaborative work detailing the intertwined lives of ravens, wolves, pumas, and the people who visit and live around Yellowstone. His presentation follows the seasons of Yellowstone and the scientific journey to decode the mysteries of raven life. Additionally, it will describe the tenuous and evolving relationship between humans, wolves, and ravens, and the challenges animals face when they wander beyond the protection a national park provides. So without further ado, Dr. John Marzluff, the floor is yours. Please add your comments and questions into the chat, and we will ask him following the presentation.
Thanks very much, Blue. And thanks for the awesome presentation, Ameline, on the dark skies. We're having lights installed on our place here right now that all face downward, and hoping to be able to enjoy our dark sky here in Montana, where I'm at, with my down coat on because it's colder than in Florida, to be able to enjoy the stars and all the other organisms that need dark. It's a really important aspect of what we do to our environment, and a pretty easy one, as you said, to do the right thing about.
Thank you. My slides didn't show. I don't know why.
I saw them.
Really? Like they showed?
Okay.
Thank you. Good luck.
Thanks, I will need it. Let's see. Have to move some stuff around here, so. Let me just get a better pointer for you as well. Okay. Well, as Blue said, I'm going to talk about ravens mostly tonight, but I'm glad to answer your questions about other things as they come up in the afterwards. So feel free to go beyond what we're talking here about tonight. But this is my latest work. It's occurring right here where I live in Montana. And it's exciting to me to be able to share this with you all so far away down in Florida. But I really want to convince you that it's important to think like a raven, mainly because they have been one of the best survivors of the biodiversity extinction crisis that we're living in now, and that they lived in, and some of our ancestors lived in at the end of the Pleistocene. What's going on here? Sorry. You never know. All right. As I said, ravens, along with some of our ancestors and wolves, survived the extinction that took many of our large charismatic megafauna from the North American continent at the end of the Pleistocene, some few million years ago. And I would say at least 2 of these species, us and ravens, continue to thrive to this day. This graph that I'm showing you here, and I'll come back to, is just one example of what ravens are able to do in our human-dominated world. They're increasing exponentially in Montana from this graph, but we've made these graphs for all around the ravens range, and they are increasing exponentially in many places because of their abilities to adjust to the things we do. And I think because of the shared history that people and ravens have had since both of us evolved. So today I want to just tell you a little bit about raven biology. I'll give you a little bit of background on their evolution as well as their behavior and evolutionary threats to them that they've basically been able to weather up to this point. I want to look back and be able to take you back to the Pleistocene. Really, it's as close as you're going to get to it is in the Yellowstone ecosystem, where all the predators, all the prey, and the scavengers exist to this day and interact much as they did several million years ago, when ice was just retreating from North America and animals were coming and going across not only Beringia, but also the connections through Central America with South America. It was a time of lots of turnover in our faunas, and the legacy of being able to see some of that at play you can do in Yellowstone. And then I want to end with basically suggesting that while I love ravens and they're very successful, they are a challenge for other species. And how might we deal with that challenge in the future is something that I've been concerned about. My collaborators in this work are primarily Matthias Loretto. He's an ornithologist in Austria. And Matthias has studied ravens in the Old World and I in the New World, and we're studying together here in Yellowstone to understand this species and where it exists here. And also some of the workers in Yellowstone, Doug Smith and Dan Staler, run the carnivore programs. Lauren Walker ran the bird program here. They have many technicians that collect the data that we use to relate the movements of our ravens to their predators and scavengers. And then a couple of undergraduates at the University of Washington in particular, Cameron Ho and Georgia Coleman. So let's take a broader view. If we look back 50,000 years ago, North America was connected to Eurasia through Beringia. And I'm sure you've all heard of the Bering Land Bridge. Well, it's really a huge bit of land here known as Beringia that is exposed when seawater is lowered, sea levels are lowered because much of the world's water is tied up in glacial ice. So as glacial periods waxed and waned, that water rose and fell, sometimes exposing land that animals lived on and didn't really just walk across, but lived there and then became isolated on either side, the New World here in Alaska or the Old World in Siberia and Russia. And ravens were involved with this changing landmass, Beringia, throughout the course of the revolution. They started diverging from African ravens some 2 to 4 million years ago, our common raven of today. And from this African origin, they spread northward and eastward into Europe and Asia and came to occupy most of the Old World. And they interacted with early humans, Neanderthals, and Homo sapiens at this time. During their tenure in the Old World, they spun off one new species, the Canary Island raven, which looks much like the common raven does today, a little browner in color, but is genetically and behaviorally distinct. Well, our story really deals with the common raven and how it came across Beringia here, heading to the east across Siberia and Russia into Alaska. And at that point, about 2 million years ago, the first common ravens entered the New World, and they occupied much of the northern tier and went down the west coast into ice-free zones during glacial periods. And during this time, just by random chance, they became a little genetically different from the ravens that remained here in the Old World once Beringia was flooded again and there was no movement back and forth. And during this time, a new species evolved in the New World, the Chihuahuan raven, from a common raven ancestor. And those of you who've been able to see that bird know it's quite distinct. It's a little smaller, lives in large groups, has a very different vocabulary than does our common raven. But what's interesting is this common raven, during the time it evolved, the Chihuahuan raven, also became isolated and variously isolated from the Old World. And about 15,000 years ago, ravens came back into the New World from the Old World over another time when Beringia was exposed and was basically covered with steppe vegetation that was conducive to ravens and wolves and people, which all came across at this time into the New World and started their interactions. From an evolutionary perspective, it's interesting in that we can look at the genetics of ravens here in North America and see some that have the signals basically of that first colonization 2 million years ago, and others that have genetic sequences that are very different, extremely different, more different among these common ravens than the common raven is with the Chihuahuan raven, which is a distinct species. So we have these two genetic forms, one of which came across about 15,000 years ago, one about 2 million years ago. They freely interbreed and do so quite successfully. So they are not, although they were on the path of becoming distinct species, that's no longer the case. They are becoming much more similar through this interbreeding and melding of gene pools. And so it's what we call seeing speciation in reverse. And this has led us to some insights into how speciation occurs to begin with. As gene pools become isolated and different and behavioral differences evolve to keep species apart, they may come back together at some point, as our ravens did, and reverse that process, homogenize that gene pool, so that we really are left now in our world with one species of common raven. Well, this species not only is interesting evolutionarily, it's interesting culturally, and it's influenced our beliefs and traditions and dances and vocabulary over the entire time that we've been co-evolving with it. And you might imagine back in the early Pleistocene, there were scavengers like some of the great Territorn, the huge vultures that lived and condors that lived in North America and scavenged from saber-toothed cats and the like. And ravens were right with them. And then as people started to utilize North America, again, 15 to 30,000 years ago, 1.5 million or more years after ravens and vultures and cats were there, that ravens quickly took on to people and scavenged from those pretty inept hunters at that point, and utilized the leftovers of their hunting and camping expeditions and their early villages. These led to creation myths about how raven was a creator in the Northwest among our Indian tribes here and around the world in terms of their importance in promoting or portending death, in protecting large societies like the English society that believed when ravens were to ever leave the Tower of London that their society would collapse, or celebrated in other parts of the world as social beings. In Asia in particular, the social behaviors of ravens and crows are celebrated and were important motivators for how human societies took on their social behaviors as well. And on to today, as these species are thriving in our urban environments, motivating things like the naming of our sports teams and our rock bands and the like. They've continued to exert their influence on our beliefs and our language. You think about when you're hungry, like I'm going to be in about a half an hour, I might be ravenous. Or as we age, we might get crow's feet under our eyes. Or to get a better lookout, go to the crow's nest. These sorts of things that have influenced our language come from the importance of this animal and its group, the ravens and crows together, on early human activity and how fundamental it was to our existence and our ability to survive in our world. Well, let's switch to a bit about ravens in particular. I know you're not fortunate to have ravens down in Florida, but I'm sure many of you have traveled around North America and Europe and been able to see this species in a variety of settings. And in all cases, what you might see most predominantly are mated pairs of adult ravens that maybe are allopreening like your crows do down there, like these two birds are doing in Yellowstone. They go through these behaviors to cement their pair bonds, to be able to coordinate their activities better, and to remove parasites from places where, like under the chin there, where a raven can't reach with its beak, and its mate helps out by doing this. So one group of ravens are territorial. They form lifelong associations like these two individuals here, and they defend space and all the food that occurs within that space. But there's another group of ravens that involves individuals for tens of years in some cases, but typically we think of as a few years during which they are non-breeders. These are young birds that have been kicked out of their territory by their parents and have gone on to flock and associate with other like-aged individuals as they roam around and look for food items, like these birds in our captive situation are doing with this raccoon. And these vagrant non-breeders have a very different lifestyle than the territorial birds. They associate with many individuals. They don't command space. They're socially subordinate to older and especially territorial individuals. And they use strength in numbers to overpower that other inherent strength that a territorial pair might have. So in particular, when food is found, work that Bernd Heinrich and my wife Colleen and I did up in Maine discovered that basically there are these two groups of ravens interact at these food sources, but in very different ways. So this little picture shows a territorial pair that found a dead moose on its territory, and they are quiet about that. They try to keep that moose to themselves to last all winter. But young birds, these vagrants that are flying around individually, they're not in a flock, but they individually forage. One of them or several of them may find a food like this that's defended. They cannot access that defended food because they're subordinate. So they go back to a roost at night, or they make noise around the carcass that attracts other individuals in, or they communicate that by the way they leave the roost at night, and it brings in a group of vagrants that now look like a structured flock that's feeding at this carcass, and by strength in numbers, the territorial pair doesn't challenge them anymore. And these groups I'll talk about later, but these are social arenas in which much displaying, perhaps finding a territorial opening or finding a potential mate occurs in these non-breeding birds. So our question, really, Matthias and I's question in Yellowstone was how this behavior might differ when they're in the presence of such a diverse group of predators, such as the eagle here, a bald eagle on this kill that was made by a wolf pack. And this food may not last very long, may not even last a day like this elk calf. And therefore, this exchange of information and attraction of others to food might not be so important, or it might be very different than where Bernd and Colleen and I studied it in Maine. And in addition to having things to scavenge from with wolves and pumas in their environment, they also have the ultimate provider, and that is us. And we provide food for them at our picnic sites where we give them handouts in particular, like this guy was throwing a ham sandwich to this raven who's begging from him at a pullout in the park. They scavenge fat from our water treatment plants, and of course, garbage from dumpsters and larger landfills. So before I get into much more detail on the particular biology that we were studying in Yellowstone, let me show you how we catch our birds. And we do that by attracting them to food, or in this case, taking advantage of ravens that were feeding on a bit of a wolf kill that was pulled out of a frozen lake. And when they come into that, we shoot a net launcher over them, catch in this case a couple of birds that we're then able to tag. We put state-of-the-art transmitters on them. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these sorts of tags that are being used on various birds and other animals around the world. Ours are solar powered. We've gotten several years of information from many of our birds now. And we basically are able to access our data through downloads from the transmitter through the cell network to a server that we were able to get the locations that the birds had been visiting over the past however long it had been since they checked in with us last. But we know about every half an hour where the bird is. We know how fast it's moving. Lots of different things about the animal and where it was during the course of its life. Some of the things we found first involve what foods they were eating. So I will show you some data slides tonight. I'm sorry, it's kind of the natural way for me to present some of this information. but I'll talk you through these. But what we have are foods that are human-derived or anthropogenic and natural. And what we saw our ravens foraging upon in the summer was not much anthropogenic food, but instead a lot of natural food. And in particular, what we saw our ravens eating in the wilds of Yellowstone in the summer was natural food, in particular things like grasshoppers and fly larvae that were developing in patties of bison poop. So really these birds, they used wolf kills, and you can see down here, they use them at a pretty small frequency relative to things like these dispersed natural resources that occur in bison poop and naturally as blooms of insects along rivers or in grassy areas where there's grasshoppers and the like, that these birds really focus on. In the winter time, it's very different. That's when they're eating mostly human-derived foods. And in particular, they're eating gut piles left by hunters that have shot deer and elk. They are eating some agricultural products, and they're eating a lot of waste. And that is not only at our dump, but in particular, like the image I showed you a second ago, they're fishing the grease off of the water surfaces of our water treatment plants. These are high energy, high calorie food items that they really utilize. And this map just shows you the extent to which our tagged birds from Yellowstone, that's the dark green area outlined here. We tagged all of our birds in and around the park in this place, and they've moved hundreds of kilometers in all directions around what we call the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, this lighter gray, to track these resources. And they do different things in different places. The purple circles here indicate use of wolf kills, primarily in what we call the northern range of Yellowstone. And outside of the park, you can see they wander widely, and occasionally they use wolf kills out there. But more importantly, they use human resources there. Things like hunter gut piles, road kills, and agricultural products. Now, breeders have some constraints during the breeding season. In particular, they've got to take care of these young kids, these fledglings, which are about adult size at this point. And they are anxious to get fed, and they beg from their parents nonstop. And their parents are back and forth feeding these young. And what we see then, if we look at data, is that they stay very close to their nests. So, for example, this is a territorial female who nested at a place called Mud Volcano, a really cool kind of devil's cauldron area in Yellowstone. And all these dots are basically about every half an hour where that bird was when it carried its tag around. And you can see that occasionally it goes 4 or 5 miles away from its nest, out here to the west, out here to the east, but most of its locations are right around its nest, within a few miles at the most. And that lasts for about a month after the young leave the nest. They're still being tended by the parent. In this case, there's a young bird begging from its mom. And during about a month of which the birds are building their nests and laying eggs and incubating them, about another month when they are feeding nestlings, and then another month post-fledging. So 3 to 4 months of the year, these territorial birds are acting just like I showed you, being very close to the nest and primarily dealing with the annual crop of young. But after that, they travel widely. This was very unexpected. We thought territorial ravens stayed around their nest all the time. Here's that nest again at Mud Volcano where our bird was. And now it's not just hanging close to the nest, but it's traveling up to 57 miles one way twice every day as it commutes from its nest area up here to another spot and then back to its nest area for the evening. Sometimes they'll short circuit and roost in between, but mostly it's these back and forth commutes. And for this bird, mostly in this kind of northwesterly direction, occasionally straight west to another town, and in between. So why is it going to the northwest? Well, that's where hunting occurs. So at this time of the year, out of the breeding season and into the autumn, people are hunting deer and elk here, and they're leaving gut piles. And each of these little points where the bird spent a considerable amount of time, several hours, is where they're foraging upon a gut pile left by hunters. Or they're over here at other hunting areas, and they're up at different places where either food is in a dumpster situation, for example, here where this bird spends a lot of its time, or at a waste treatment plant, a water treatment plant, like I mentioned, fishing grease off of that. So this bird, which is territorial and spends a lot of time around its nest for 4 months or so of the year, is commuting the rest of the time, mainly to these human-derived resources. Juveniles do a very different thing. This is a young bird I caught in Yellowstone at a bison carcass in the winter in January, and over the course of the next few months, when this bird was less than a half a year old, it started wandering up to the north into various mountainous areas, and then gradually along the spine of the Rocky Mountains up into Canada, where it established a place where it lived for the next 2.5 years, during which we followed its locations daily. Now, unfortunately, because our tags were communicating on the 3G network, we can't get these remote locations in a place like this that have switched off the 3G cell network. But the bird is probably territorial up here, given its behavior over this course of time. We've had others do similar things, and we are able to keep up with them, even with the change in the cell network. But anyway, this bird has used human resources along the way. Each of these yellow dots is an agricultural or other human-provided resource that we know it was using, and the red dots are power lines that it roosts on, which are also constructs in a very open area that allow this species to spread further and further afield. Even older non-breeders. In this case, this bird is, to us, we know, at least 5 years old, probably much older. It covered an area of about 6,500 square miles over the first 1.5 years that we had tagged it. Here's Yellowstone Lake, for those of you familiar with the area. This is the boundary between Wyoming and Montana and Idaho down here. So it's covering a three-state area, utilizing human resources and some natural ones throughout this huge area. So to summarize some of these first findings, we found that these birds travel widely, much more widely than we ever expected, especially those that own territory, even with these daily commutes. And most of this is driven by the exploitation of human resources. So to summarize that, territorial birds in the summer stay right around their nests and then travel widely in the winter. Vagrant non-breeders basically travel widely both in the summer and the winter. This just shows the displacement on a given day, how many kilometers an individual is moving on a given day. 20 to 30 kilometers for these territorial birds in the non-breeding season, and similarly for vagrants throughout the year. So what about some individual strategies? Ravens aren't all doing the same thing. And I'll show that pictorially here. If you just focus on the different colors, which are different sorts of foods that each of these rows, which is an individual tagged raven, is utilizing. So we have some ravens up here that are usually mostly orange and red sorts of foods. And those are human-derived ones, waste foods and gut piles from hunters. Others that are using more of the cool blue, which are insect faunas for the most part, and especially during the summer, but some are really specialists. This individual is an absolute specialist on bison patties. And others, the purple and red, are using more wolf kills and other predator-derived foods. So there's variation. Not all birds are the same. They use the same composition of foods, but to different extents. And there was a cool study that just came out that showed that ravens from 70,000 years ago had the same diet, a mix of human and natural derived foods. And there was variation, but in roughly similar proportions to what we're seeing today among these ravens that were living with Neanderthals in Europe that we see in Yellowstone today. So what about those that really use wolves? Let's call them wolfers and see how they utilize this animal. Some people had suggested in the past that there was really a symbiotic relationship, that wolves were benefiting from the eyes of ravens and the ability of ravens to scour large areas. and ravens were benefiting by the food provided by wolves. And this has been noted by Dave Meach, who is an expert on wolves, who suggested that the ravens on Isle Royale might be completely dependent upon wolves for all of their food. And by colleagues that have been working in Yellowstone before we started, that had seen ravens being quick to not only find food, but that was provided by predators, but maybe even to point out to predators where a potential meal might lie. And so from that study, Dan Staler had shown that whenever you see a wolf, about 87% of the time, there was a raven with that wolf. And when ravens were hunting, either at a kill or chasing things, it was an even higher percentage. And that's very different than what you see ravens and coyotes, which aren't associated to nearly that extent. Only 3% of the time do you see ravens with coyotes. But if you see wolves, you almost always see a raven with it. Well, our tagged birds started telling us a bit of a different story. While you might always see a raven with a wolf, if you just follow the wolf or follow the raven, think like the raven, you don't always see wolves, that raven with a particular wolf. About half of the wolf kills that were studied by our colleagues during our first 2 years of work were visited by one of our tagged birds, and some of them had a dozen of our tagged birds at it. And almost all of our tagged birds did indeed visit a predator kill during their first 3 years of study. So 59 of our 69 tagged ravens were with wolves or cougars or bears at a kill at least once. But if you look at even the one of our ravens that spent the most time with wolves, they are not always with that wolf pack. And we've tried to show that with this graph. And let me just walk you through this one. I know it's a bit confusing, but we have time of years and months going across the x-axis down here. So from January of 2020 to January of 2022 in this graph. And distance between our tagged raven, in this case, a vagrant male that went to 54 different wolf kills during this 2.5 year period, the distance between him and any also radio tagged wolf that's in the ecosystem, which all of the packs that are in Yellowstone, there's always at least 2 or more wolves that are radio tagged within that pack as well. So we're able to see how often are they together and how close are they. And the red line here indicates when, if you're below this red line, the wolf and the raven is within 500 meters of each other. And we suggest that the raven probably knows that wolf is there at that close. And sometimes they're a lot closer together. So here's some that are within 100 meters or so of one another. But if you look at all of the points that are below that red line, there's a few cases where where this raven was close to a wolf. And mostly it's the same pack. The green lines here are the wolves in the Junction Butte pack, which are the predominant pack in the northern range of Yellowstone. So here, all these green dots in 2020 indicate that our raven was close to that wolf pack. But here, if we go the next year, he's with a different pack for a while. He's with the Rescue Creek pack. He's also with the 8 Mile pack here, close to him, the pink. But mostly this bird spends time with one pack of wolves. But most of the time, the raven is very far away from that wolf pack. All of these points up here, this blob of color indicates that our raven is far away from these wolves, up to tens of thousands of meters away from that wolf pack. So even here, where he's close to the Junction Butte pack on and off during 2020, there were many times where he's far away from them as well. So it's not like he's just riding with this pack and has a favorite pack that he associates with all the time and waits for them to kill. No. He takes advantage of them when they make a kill, but he's also then going and using human resources at other times when he's far away up here from that pack of wolves. And that's the story we see with most of our birds. Let me show you some examples of the association between one of our tagged territorial birds, which tend to exploit wolves that are close to their territory. So this female raven, all the small purple dots, she has a nest over here where this cluster of points is. But these balloons and the larger circles indicate wolf movements, tagged wolves. and the balloons indicate where wolves had made a kill. And you can see that our purple female here is with the wolves here, closely associated at a kill, at another kill, and even another one over here. And so she is exploiting this pack, which is the Junction Butte pack I mentioned before. She's exploiting them in many different places, but all pretty close within a few miles of her territorial center. And at other times, she's not close to the wolves at all. She's wandering off in other places, spending her time tracking other resources. Sometimes she follows wolves as well. We could document this a few times, but not very frequently. So here she was over on her territory and she flew across. This is the Lamar Valley, the Lamar River. She flies across several miles to join the wolves here as they are moving this direction. And they finally coalesce in a small ravine here where they've made a kill, and she spends time with them at that kill. But she didn't just fly straight to the kill. She flew over here where the wolves were hunting, stayed with them as Dan Staler had documented, and followed them to this kill. But that's the exception. Most of the time she's not doing that. She comes in after the kill is made. And here's her plot, like I showed you for that non-breeder. And again, most of the time she is far away from wolves, but occasionally, like especially here in 2020, she was very close to the Junction Butte pack, probably those data I just showed you. She's close to them later in the year, and then joins the Molly's pack, another one in her area. Over here, she joins the Carnelian Creek pack, and here the Rescue Creek pack as well. So she's using many different packs that happen to come through her home range or that she tracks far away from there to get her foods. And the dynamic that occurs at a wolf kill looks something like this. Here was a situation where I was watching ravens and wolves came through hunting in the valley there, and there was one raven following that wolf pack. So again, if you watch wolves, you always see ravens, but if you watch a tagged raven, you don't always see wolves. So here there was one raven with the wolves. The wolves flushed a large bull elk and killed it early that morning. And there was immediately 4 ravens with them. And that grew to about 15 during the course of that day. The next day, as ravens went to sleep, of course, that night, and the next morning, there's 7, 10, 15 or more ravens at that kill, up to 23, suggesting that some ravens might have come from the roost, like we saw in Maine, to find this kill. But most of them were there from the previous day and probably individually knew about it. Then over the course of the next several days, as wolves are eating more and more of that elk and there's less food available for ravens, the ravens decline in number and eventually leave that kill. So let's look at what we saw if we focus on our territorial and non-breeding birds at a kill. So here's that kill we were just talking about. And there was one of our non-breeders here about 100 miles away in Bozeman, another one here in yellow about 100 miles away near Billings, Montana, and 2 of our territorial birds that live close to that kill site. And the next day, those territorial birds were right at that kill early the morning when it was made. They were the first ones there. They probably heard the wolves that night. The kill was made at night in this case. And they immediately came in to check it out and ate there during that day. The next day, from Bozeman, that non-breeding individual decided to go on a flight and flew 140 miles into this wolf kill. The very next day, the bird from Billings flew a straight line, basically over the highest peaks in Montana, into that wolf kill. How in the heck those birds knew where this kill was, if they did, is a mystery to us. But as I'll suggest, I don't think they did know that kill was there. If we look just at the points, all of these purple points are the movements of that individual that came in here from Billings. It was up here by a landfill when it made its flight in like this over those high mountains to that kill in the northern range. But what you see from this pattern is that this bird's done this before. It's come in several times on this same flight pattern from the east, coming in, and it spends a lot of time moving through the valley. All this black is just a huge concentration of points that this bird has used. And it regularly makes that trip in looking for food, I think, or maybe looking more for this, not really the bison that's the food item here, but the fact that there's a party going on. And this bird can come into that party and display with others. You can see of these birds that are at this bison. Yes, there are a few that are eating, that are hungry, but this bird, these birds over here, these birds over here with their, what we call ears up and pants down, they're all displaying their status. They're looking for potential mates. They're staking their claim to this territory. They're trying to maybe take the next step if these are non-breeders, or if they're breeders, to make sure they keep their land away from these potential intruders. So there's a lot that goes on at a kill that has nothing to do with eating. It has a lot to do with socializing and displaying and forming associations with one another. And that may be why these ravens initially come in. They come in looking for other ravens. They can eat a little bit, but they get a lot of interaction. So what might wolves get from this? Remember that many researchers had suggested this was a symbiotic relationship, that ravens were getting a lot. We know they get food and socialization from these sorts of interactions. But what about wolves? Do they get anything? Well, we have some insights to that from our data. So what I'm going to show you are similar maps that we just looked at. There are balloons that indicate places where we had ravens feeding as a group, tagged ravens as a group. So a yellow one here and a yellow one here. And just notice that at this one, there are no big circles around it, no blue or red dots, so no wolves. At this one, there were ravens and wolves together. The red dots here are from a tagged wolf from the Cougar Creek pack. And these tagged ravens and tagged wolves were together at this kill. And probably it was a situation like I had just suggested, where wolves made a kill and ravens exploited it. But here, there are ravens and no wolves. The wolves are way out here, distant from that kill. And over the next day, the ravens still remain. The yellow circle, the yellow balloon indicates there is a group of ravens, and the blue and red circle indicate the wolves are getting closer. The next day, so 2 days after the ravens were first there at this site, now the wolf pack is all there, the Junction Butte pack. They stay there for the next day right at that. So this suggests to us that ravens were feeding on something, maybe a winter killed or other naturally killed animal in the park, and the wolves found it, perhaps by hearing the ravens, or maybe just found it on their own, but maybe the ravens helped facilitate this, the location of this food for this pack of wolves. And then after the wolves have been there a few days, they wander off back to the direction they came from. They're still ravens, still tagged ravens at that food source. So if we add up all of our cases like this, basically we had situations like this where 17 times we had ravens there before wolves, and then 19 times wolves there before ravens. And that was at a place that we didn't know was a wolf kill. If you add in wolf kills, there's at least a 6-fold greater benefit to the ravens in finding food that wolves have killed than wolves finding food that ravens might have located first. And as far as other carnivores go, pumas are the other major carnivore in our area during the winter time. And we basically never saw ravens come in and cougars follow ravens to food, but occasionally we see cougars at a place where there are then ravens. For example, in this, here's a cougar that has got her kill, a deer cached here. Cougars, unlike wolves, which leave their food scattered and easy to find, they hide their food from things like ravens. And she's very cautious, as you can see, going back in to feed upon her prize here. Well, the next day, one of our tagged ravens was at that same food source. So even though she's covered it up, you can barely see it. This is a territorial male that lives right where that cougar also lives, and he found that food and is exploiting it as well. That's the more typical scene for pumas and ravens. Pumas kill, ravens scavenge. And with wolves, it's mostly that, and occasionally otherwise, where ravens might cue wolves into potential food. Well, let's move beyond their scavenging with these sorts of organisms into how they utilize us. And as I said, in parts of the park, it's not uncommon to see a raven like this, approaching a tourist, looking at him forlornly, like a puppy looking for a handout, and that people just can't resist. Here's this big bird. These birds are 2, 3 times the size of your crows. They walk up and look at a guy like this, and all he can do is throw his ham sandwich to them. Well, one of our birds that's tagged was especially good at exploiting people. And this bird is kind of an interesting, longer story, but let me tell you about it. You can see I've tagged her with a blue and white leg band, and also you can see the small antenna in the reflection here better sticking out of her backpack. That is the radio transmitter that we keep up with her. I caught her in a small town called Cook City in Montana, and unbeknownst to me, she was already the town's pet raven. Not a pet in that source and that sort of a meaning, but she was a pet in that the people in town looked after her, like Molly here in her cabin, who would feed Stevie. They called the raven every day because Stevie had a bit of a crippled foot, and they were worried about her being able to survive. She got so aggressive at pounding on their window that they finally hung this bell up, which Stevie would ring, and Molly would then bring out roast beef and other sorts of things for the bird to eat. It really had a great deal. Stevie, I then tagged, and it upset the people of Cook City because they really liked this bird, and it was untagged when they were first associating with it. And then all of a sudden it shows up with all this jewelry on, and they're wondering what the heck's going on and who would do such a thing to their bird. Of course, I had no idea about this when I tagged her, but I was fortunate in selecting blue and white to put on her leg. Just by chance, we tag our birds with unique color combinations. And as it turns out, Molly's husband was a Kentucky Wildcat fan, and their colors are blue and white. So he did not, as much as he wanted to, take the bands off of this bird. Well, we followed Stevie, and you can see that she actually covers a large area. This is about 100 miles or so across, and she's utilizing not just Molly and her place, but lots of other spots. And one place she tended to concentrate a lot was in the wilderness by this lake. And we didn't really know what was going on there till we took a closer look and saw a cabin underneath that cloud of points. So we hiked in. Here's the cabin here. We're hiking in across a marshy area to find out who lives at this cabin and meet them. And as it turns out, it was the former Lieutenant Governor of South Dakota, who also had a strong relationship with Stevie and was feeding Stevie chips and other things at his cabin in the wilderness. So this bird was exploiting people all over the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, forming strong personal relationships with some and more general relationships with others. Well, ravens don't only beg, they steal. And in Grand Canyon, here's a raven exhibiting some of their behavior there, where they will unzip and unvelcro packs to get at foods that are within there. This raven didn't find any food, although he certainly rifled through a bunch of other items that were in this pack. And ravens had been doing this in Old Faithful within Yellowstone. So I headed there to try to understand how they were utilizing this landscape, which does host people during the winter at snow-tells, they're called. And if we look at an aerial view of Old Faithful, the developed area here, you can see lots of buildings and parking lots and things. And we have 2 of our tagged birds that split up that area. They're both territorial females. And I went in to see how they were utilizing people there and found them scavenging, much as Stevie did, from tourists that were there in the winter, but not opening up their backpacks or opening up the saddlebags that are on snowmobiles, which they had been purported to do for some time. And it was interesting that basically the reason they weren't opening up those saddlebags is because now the snowmobiles have these hard cases on them that lock, primarily because ravens were getting into them so easily before that the tour guides there now have gone to these newer versions of saddlebags for tourists to put their backpacks in. And ravens can't get into those yet. And they're getting upset about it. And this white spot on the seat here isn't poop from a raven. It's where a raven is actually broken into the foam core of this seat and torn it up. And so we have what we have termed cultural coevolution, where ravens and humans are co-evolving kind of in an arms race here. Ravens were winning the battle of getting into soft-sided saddlebags. Now they've been deterred from that, and they're taking out their vengeance on other parts of the snowmobile. Well, let me end with talking a little bit about the concern of this supremely adaptive and successful species that is showing these exponential rises in population size throughout the Western US and in other places. And in the West, of course, we have several endangered species, 3 of them here: snowy plovers, greater sage grouse, and desert tortoises. And those are all on the menu of a raven, because ravens aren't just scavengers, they are also opportunistic predators. And they take advantage of young plovers or grouse eggs or small desert tortoises. And they are a limiting factor on these species today. But the primary reason they're a limiting factor is because we have destroyed the habitat that these animals need, and we have put them at very low numbers: the plovers, the grouse, the tortoises, low numbers in their environment. And on the other hand, we have accelerated the growth of ravens by providing habitat and foods for them, those power lines that our bird dispersed along, or the gut piles that our birds eat outside of Yellowstone, for example. These birds now are posing a threat to these species. Well, unfortunately, the response has been to just kill ravens, to kill the messenger in this case. And this is the total number of birds killed by our US government over years, number of ravens killed. And basically, for the last several years, we're killing around 10,000 ravens every year as a way to try to lessen predation, not only on our agricultural crops, but also on these endangered species. And our research has suggested that this is it's 1, not sustainable, and 2, ineffective, because the ravens are still increasing and the endangered species are still decreasing. It isn't effective because what we need to do to reduce raven use of an area where there's endangered species is to get rid of the subsidies there. Things like the dumps, like the water treatment plants, to make them less attractive to ravens by making the food unattainable or making it dangerous for a raven to be there. Not that it gets killed, because those individuals don't learn, but that they get hazed from these places and learn not to go there, and others don't follow them there. To control subsidies, which are placed out by people that are feeding wildlife in some of these cases, and basically to enforce the Endangered Species Act on the subsidies that are being put out that are fueling this growth of raven populations. That would keep ravens from the area. It would lower the population growth rate in a meaningful way that would be beneficial for our rare species. Otherwise, it's going to be like this. All the ravens and crows are basically passing on their knowledge of where these resources are over huge areas, and others are using them. So with that, I would thank you for your attention. Thanks for the invitation from all of you to be here and to speak with you. If you'd like to learn more, you could go to the University of Washington's Avian Conservation Lab website and find out a bit about some of the other work we're doing and some of the scientific papers that we made available there. There are a couple of apps you might be interested in. Animal Tracker is a free app that allows you to track and see where some of our tagged ravens are, and in addition, lots of other animals that are tagged around the world. And Crow Scientist is a free app that allows you to basically learn a bit about crow behavior and kind of play a game to find all the different behaviors you can find your crows doing. And it's a good way for kids to gather data for science fair projects or just to learn more about some of the species that we live closely with. With that, I will stop sharing. Oops. And be glad to answer some questions that you might have or comments you might have.
Thanks for that presentation. It was actually really interesting to learn about this really new science. And thanks for explaining the maps to us too. Really Appreciate that. We have a couple of questions in the chat. Kevin Baker started us off by asking, is there a history of ravens being used for sending messages, or is that something from Game of Thrones fiction?
There are lots of legends about it, even in the Bible, where they would bring messages and sustenance to some of the people that were exiled, some of the Israelites that were exiled in the desert. But messengers, they've been used, pigeons, of course, a lot more than ravens have, but ravens were used to find land by Vikings and other explorers. They would let them go. And if they returned right away, they would know there was no land around. If they never came back, they assumed there was land in that direction, and they would follow the ravens to that place. They were used to intimidate people in warfare as well, much more so than they were used to send a message like a written one. They were used to say, hey, we've got this very powerful bird with us, and you're going to suffer because of it. So they definitely gave messages, but not so much in written form.
I really liked hearing about you talk about humans' relationships to these birds so often. My uncle always would say, we don't play well. The Dolphins don't play well, the football team, against the Baltimore Ravens, because we don't have ravens in the state of Florida, which I always thought was funny. Do you think it's possible to have vagrant ravens in Florida, or is it that the climate here is not really suitable to them?
I mean, it's possible. A raven colonized Hawaii, the most distant, landmass we have, and became the Hawaiian crow there. So these birds, they're able to fly hundreds of miles, hundreds of kilometers. And as our resources are provided over greater and greater areas, I think it's very likely that they will end up in more southern locales. It's not the heat that bothers them. They live in the bottom of Death Valley. It's not the cold that bothers them. They live up on, the upper camps in the Himalayas. So these birds can handle anything that the environment throws at them, as long as there's food. And we're really good at providing reliable foods, and they're going to figure it out sooner or later.
Anne Rimler asks, do the birds seem attracted to the identifying tags and devices on the tagged birds, or do tags make an individual bird less attractive?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one we, of course, worry about all the time. What effects are we having, not only attracting an individual to a tag or not, but other effects on the bird, just handicapping it by putting this backpack on. So we keep our backpacks less than 3% of the body weight, or right around 3% of the body weight of the birds. We haven't detected major issues. We had one bird who kind of outgrew his backpack, and that was a problem. Fortunately, we got him and were able to take that off and rehab him. As far as their attraction, they certainly preen around that backpack. We have certainly had many backpacks there's 4 little loops that our harness goes through, like the straps on your pack, to hold it onto the bird's back. And we have had several recoveries of our backpacks that have been broken at one of those loops and shed because of that. And we make our packs so they don't come off unless something like that happens, in which case they come off easily. And there's no way that the individual wearing that backpack could have broken it there. It had to have been broken by another raven, probably its mate in that case. And so they're preening around it, they're fiddling with it, they break the antennas. They don't like wearing these things, and they definitely work to get them off, and their mates probably do as well.
Speaking of new technology, Ameline Cook says that was so cool how you caught them with the nets to track them. I definitely agree. Ryan Tomazin says, I had a raven with a tag backpack at Mud Volcano in June 2021.
Wow, that was that bird.
And wow, that's so cool. Kristen Larson wants to know, have high levels of metals been found in ravens?
I'm sorry, what was that again, Blue?
if high levels of metals have been
Oh.
found in ravens?
Yes, lead in particular, because of their use of those hunter derived gut piles. And as much as we would like to, we've tried to outlaw lead nationwide in ammunition, and that was not possible. It is used less frequently now by most hunters. They use copper bullets or bismuth or other sorts of metals that are not as toxic to